It started with a Bulldozer 3, actually lined up across my driveway like I was some criminal hiding behind a tomato plant. They thought I'd back down. They thought I was just some old man with a few vegetables and too much time on his hands. What they didn't know is, I own more than just my home. I own the land under their feet. What came next? It wasn't just a property dispute. It became a war of rights, revenge, and one community's fight to take back their power. And believe me, you'll want to stay till the end because the twist. No one saw it coming. Before we begin, let me know what time it is, where you are, and where you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story too. They say retirement is supposed to be peaceful. For me, it was a second chance. After 4 decades working in real estate law in Boston, endless phone calls, brutal deadlines, clients who thought they were smarter than the law, I finally walked away. I bought a weathered old farmhouse in Ashridge, Maine, the same place my grandfather used to bring me every summer when I was a boy. The land had changed, the people had changed, but the soil? The soil still smelled the same when I sank my hands into it. Most mornings I'd wake up at 5, feed the chickens, check the irrigation lines, then settle in for a few quiet hours in the garden. Tomatoes were my favorite. Heirloom varieties with names like Brandywine and Cherokee. Purple, growing in neat rows of raised beds I built with lumber, salvaged from the barn's old rafters. I didn't need much. Just the morning sun, my radio, and the soft chatter of the crows watching from the oaks. That spring morning started like any other. A light breeze off the bay, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, and the low hum of bees from the hives. I'd tended all winter. I was kneeling by the driveway, planting a second row of marigolds to ward off pests, when I heard it. The sound of heels on gravel. "Mr. Whitaker," a voice called. Sharp, clipped, not friendly. I looked up slowly, dusting my hands on my jeans. There she stood, Karen McAllister, president of the Ashridge Village HOA. Immaculate as always. Not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in her beige slacks. Sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She held a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Good morning, Karen," I said, offering a polite smile. "Nice day, isn't it?" She didn't smile back. "You're in violation," she said flatly, waving the clipboard toward my flower bed. According to Bylaw 7, 3B, no visible gardening structures may be within 10 feet of a main road. This, she gestured at my rows of raised beds, is not compliant. I stood slowly, brushing the dirt off my knees. "Karen, with all due respect, my land predates the HOA by more than 100 years. I've got exemptions documented in both county and state filings. You can't apply post-development bylaws to a grandfathered property." She didn't flinch. "You're not above the rules, Mr. Whitaker. Your garden is visible from the road. It disturbs the uniform aesthetic of Ashridge Village." Uniform aesthetic. That phrase again. I kept my voice calm. "Would you like to see the deed language? It's all in black and white." "I've already taken pictures," she replied, snapping a few more with her phone like I was a crime scene. "Expect a formal notice in the mail. We'll schedule a compliance hearing within 10 business days." With that, she turned on her heel and walked off, the scent of her overly expensive perfume lingering behind her. My chickens clucked disapprovingly from their coop. Even they didn't like her. Later that afternoon, the notice arrived in my mailbox, $300 daily fines until the raised beds were removed. I pinned it on the fridge under a tomato-shaped magnet and poured myself a glass of bourbon. I'd dealt with petty HOA nonsense before. This felt different, more targeted, more aggressive. The next day, while I was checking the irrigation lines, old Hank Parker from 2 lots down stopped by. Vietnam vet, proud of his American flag, his backyard smoker, and his completely unauthorized windmill. "Karen gave me hell last week," he said, spitting tobacco into the grass. "Said my grill's smoke violated air quality standards. In my own damn backyard. She threatened to fine me for beehives," I replied, shaking my head. "Claimed they attract pests." Bees are pests, technically, Hank grinned. But useful ones. We both laughed, but it wasn't funny. Not really. That evening, just before sunset, I got a call from Mabel Green, the elderly widow who lived across from the old church. Her voice was shaking. "Eli," she said, "they fined me $500 because my shutters were painted eggshell instead of cream. I can't afford this. I promised to look into it." Mabel's husband had built that house with his own 2 hands. He died before the HOA was ever formed. She'd never missed a dues payment, never caused trouble. But Karen didn't care. Something was wrong. And I intended to find out what. I climbed up into the attic after dinner, flashlight in hand. My grandfather's old documents were still up there: land surveys, original purchase contracts, maps dating back to the 1800s. I knew there had to be something that proved what I'd always believed, that my land, and several others like it, weren't under HOA jurisdiction. I found the leather-bound folder just after midnight, buried under a tarp, marked Barn Repairs 1962. Inside was a land charter dated 1831, signed by the governor of Maine himself, handwritten in ink that had faded to brown but still legible. It detailed the Whitaker homestead and its original boundaries that extended far beyond my current lot. At the back of the folder was an amendment from 1974, when my father sold part of the land to the Ashridge Development Company. It explicitly stated that the original 5 lots, including mine, would be exempt from any future development covenants, restrictions, or oversight. There it was, ironclad, legal, clear. I went to bed that night with a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because I finally had proof. Dread because I knew Karen wouldn't back down quietly. Not the way she strutted around like she owned the whole town. She was going to push harder, and I was ready. I thought having the land deed would be enough. I really did. The morning after I found the charter, I made a few copies and took one down to the town clerk's office just to get it officially recertified and entered into the digital record. The clerk, a young guy named Connor, blinked when he saw the date at the top of the document. 1831, he muttered. "You sure this is real?" "Sure as the sunrise," I said. "It's been in my family for generations. It predates the town's incorporation." Connor gave a low whistle and called over his supervisor. They spent 20 minutes verifying its authenticity, comparing it with maps and prior records. In the end, they both nodded and stamped it with the county seal. I walked out of there with a document no HOA lawyer could touch, or so I thought. Later that same afternoon, I was sitting on my porch, sipping sweet tea, and watching a couple of mourning doves chase each other through the sycamore tree when a black SUV rolled up and parked at the curb. The windows were tinted. I recognized the HOA logo on the side. Out stepped Lance Breyer, HOA legal counsel, tall and pale with slicked back hair and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. "Mr. Whitaker," he greeted me coolly, not bothering to shake my hand. "I'd like to speak with you about your recent communications with the county." I leaned back in my chair and motioned for him to take the other. He didn't. "Did Karen send you?" "I represent the board," he replied, ignoring the question. "Specifically, I'm here to inform you that legal precedent supports the HOA's right to enforce bylaws retroactively in cases where community integrity is at stake." "Community integrity?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's an interesting phrase for bullying retirees and pulling up tomato plants." Lance didn't blink. "You're refusing to comply with a posted violation. That alone opens you up to additional penalties, including possible liens against your property." I stood slowly, my heart pounding, not with fear but fury. "You really think you can bluff me with that garbage?" I said, voice low. "You're looking at a man who spent 40 years in real estate litigation. I've sued developers with deeper pockets than your entire board combined. You're not just barking up the wrong tree. Son, you're trespassing on private land. I suggest you leave." For the first time, I saw something shift behind his eyes. Just a flicker, but enough. He cleared his throat, nodded stiffly. and walked back to his SUV without another word. The moment he drove off, I knew things were about to escalate. By Friday, it wasn't just me. Mabel called again, this time sobbing. She'd gotten a notice claiming her mailbox was non-compliant. She didn't even have a mailbox. Her mail came through a slot in the door. Hank said someone came by to measure the distance between his garden shed and the fence line. Another neighbor, a young mom named Lisa, was fined for letting her 3-year-old ride a plastic tricycle on the sidewalk. It was like a quiet war had begun, and the HOA was deploying every rule they could weaponize. I started a file, labeled it HOA harassment. I kept every notice, every photo, every email, every witness statement. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to build a case. The final straw came the next Tuesday morning. I woke up to the sound of buzzing, not bees, engines. The first pulled back the curtain and saw a landscaping crew cutting down the old hedgerow that lined the front of my property. These shrubs had been here longer than the road itself. I ran outside, barefoot, yelling over the roar of the chainsaws. Stop! What the hell do you think you're doing? The man in charge, a guy with a clipboard and a fluorescent vest, shouted back, HOA ordered it, said the hedge was encroaching on the sidewalk easement. This is my land, I barked. That hedge is on private property. He shrugged. Take it up with the board, man. I just do what they pay me to do. I stood there, helpless, as they hacked away years of growth and privacy. It wasn't about landscaping. It was about sending a message. By that evening, I'd had enough. I called Eleanor. She'd been quiet since our first chat, but I had a feeling she knew more than she let on. When she answered, I got straight to the point. Eleanor, I said, how long has this been going on? There was a pause. Then she sighed. Since Karen took over, 4 years ago. Maybe longer, if you count the shady accounting that started when her husband volunteered to manage the HOA's books. She has him cooking the numbers? I don't have proof, she said, but I've been keeping records, quietly, carefully. I looked at the pile of documents on my kitchen table. I think it's time we stop being quiet. She hesitated. Then, come by tomorrow, and bring your grandfather's land charter. I think we might be able to put a stop to this. But it won't be easy. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I'm ready. And I meant it. This wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. The next morning, the sun hadn't even burned off the fog when I heard them engines. Again. But this time, not lawnmowers or landscaping crews. These were heavier, meaner. I stepped out onto my porch, coffee still in hand, and froze. Parked directly across my gravel driveway were 3 bulldozers, lined up like tanks ready for battle. The metal beasts idled loudly, coughing diesel into the morning air. Behind them stood Karen McAllister, dressed in a crisp gray pantsuit and wearing a smug smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked like she was filming a commercial for some corporate law firm. Flanking her was Lance Breyer, clipboard in hand, and 3 HOA board members I'd never even seen before. I walked down the steps slowly, my boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. Karen waved like we were old friends meeting for brunch. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," she called, projecting her voice so the small crowd of onlookers gathering down the street could hear. "We've come to address your ongoing non-compliance." I glanced at the bulldozers. "That's a lot of horsepower for a few tomatoes." "This is a formal remediation," she said sharply, "authorized by Section 9.4 of the HOA Covenant. You've failed to correct multiple violations, and your raised beds have been declared public nuisances. As such, we are proceeding with immediate removal." "You're out of your damn mind," I muttered. "Excuse me?" Karen cocked her head, smile sharpening. I raised my voice now, addressing the crowd. "These machines are trespassing. This is private property, protected by deed, county records, and state law. I have documentation proving my exemption from HOA oversight. And unless you brought a court order, which I highly doubt, you're about to be on the wrong side of a lawsuit so fast, your heads will spin." Lance stepped forward, trying to sound official. "Mr. Whitaker, we have the authority of the board and legal precedent." I cut him off. "Legal precedent doesn't override my land deed. And It sure as hell doesn't justify sending in demolition equipment like it's a war zone. The lead bulldozer operator, a guy in his 40s with grease-stained gloves, climbed out of his cab and approached me quietly. "Look, sir," he said, voice low so the others couldn't hear. "They told us this was approved city property." "You're saying it's not?" "It's absolutely not," I said. "And I suggest you turn those engines off before you lose your license." He gave me a slow nod and walked back to his machine, but didn't start it. Karen's smile began to fade. "This is obstruction," she snapped. "You're delaying official action. I can have you fined." I pulled out my phone. "And I can have the sheriff here in 5 minutes." She snorted. "Sheriff Martinez is an elected official. He won't interfere in HOA business." I didn't reply. I just sent the text. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard a siren. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up and parked directly in front of my fence. Sheriff Ben Martinez, a no-nonsense guy in his 60s with a permanent squint and a gut full of coffee, stepped out. He adjusted his belt, took one look at the bulldozers, and sighed. "Karen," he said. "What the hell is this?" She rushed forward. "Sheriff, we're executing an authorized remediation order. Where's the court approval?" he asked, cutting her off. She blinked. "It's an internal matter. HOA protocol allows." "No," he said firmly. "Karen, you're bringing in heavy machinery to private property without a court order. That's not an internal matter. That's criminal trespass." Lance stepped in. "We were under the impression that the easement belongs to me," I said loudly. "Inherited, documented, filed with the county, and as of yesterday morning, officially recertified." I reached into my folder and handed Sheriff Martinez a copy of the 1831 charter, along with a 1974 exemption clause and the county clerk's signed affidavit. He took a moment, read the papers carefully, then looked up. "Damn," he muttered. Karen stepped toward him, now clearly flustered. "Sheriff, you can't possibly believe—" He held up a hand. "Karen, if this document's legit, and from what I can see, it is then not only is Mr. Whitaker exempt from HOA rules, but these bulldozers are currently parked on private land without consent. That makes this a law enforcement matter." Karen's face flushed red. "This is outrageous. The board will not be intimidated." The sheriff turned to the bulldozer operators. "I'm going to need you all to shut down your engines and move those machines off the property. Immediately." They didn't need to be told twice. One by one, the machines powered down. The lead operator gave me a respectful nod as he turned his dozer around. Karen looked around, desperate, her composure slipping with every passing second. "You haven't heard the last of this," she hissed at me. "Oh," I said, stepping closer, "I'm counting on that. Because this wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about power. And the people who abuse it." That afternoon, the air felt different. The bulldozers were gone. Karen had stormed off in her black Lexus, Lance trailing behind her like a deflated balloon. Sheriff Martinez stuck around for a few minutes, made some notes, and told me he'd file a formal report. "Keep everything," he advised, nodding toward the thick folder in my hands. "This may end up in court." I didn't doubt it for a second. The real victory wasn't in stopping the demolition, though, that felt damn good. The real prize was in the look on Karen's face when she realized she wasn't the one in control. For once, she couldn't bully or bluff her way out of it. But something still bugged me. Why the overkill? Why bring in 3 bulldozers for a few garden beds? Why risk public embarrassment, police intervention, and lawsuits just to rip out tomatoes? Unless this wasn't really about the garden. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what Eleanor had said on the phone about shady accounting, about quiet records she'd been keeping. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by deeds, maps, and land surveys, my grandfather's old leather folder now dog-eared and stained with coffee. Around 4 a.m., something caught my eye. It was an old plat map from 1973 hand, drawn in ink on heavy parchment. The developer's name was still visible in the top corner, Ashridge Development Corp. On it were outlines of the original 5 homesteads, mine, Eleanor's, and 3 others I recognized from memory. But what struck me was a faint, almost invisible line that ran beneath the roads and lots. A series of utility easements, gas, water, electric, that passed directly through every property in the subdivision. And the rights to those utility lines? A small note scribbled in the margin read, "All subterranean easements retained by Whitaker Family Trust. See Addendum C." My pulse quickened. Addendum C wasn't in the main folder. I had no idea where it was until I remembered something Grandpa used to say when I was a kid. The most important papers aren't in the safe. They're where no one would think to look. I ran out to the barn. The building had been there since the 1880s, reinforced a dozen times over, but still sturdy as an oak. I slid open the creaky trapdoor beneath the workbench and lowered myself into the crawl space. Flashlight gripped tight. It didn't take long. Tucked into a rusted ammo box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a second folder. Addendum C. Back at the kitchen table, I flipped it open with trembling hands. Inside were notarized documents confirming that the Whitaker Trust retained perpetual utility and mineral rights beneath all 600 acres of Ashridge Village, including streets, sidewalks, and green belts. In plain English, I didn't just own my property, I owned the land underneath nearly every home in the entire subdivision. No wonder Karen panicked. No wonder she brought in bulldozers. She must have seen the filings at the county office after I registered the charter and realized what it meant. And that's when I saw the real kicker, a clause that allowed the Whitaker Trust to revoke access to any utilities crossing its easements if legal boundaries were violated. They'd crossed the line literally and legally. I sat back in my chair, stunned. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was leverage. Around mid-morning, I walked over to Eleanor's cottage with the new documents tucked under my arm. She opened the door in her signature cardigan and house slippers, holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea. "I hoped you'd come," she said, letting me in. Her place smelled like old books and cinnamon. Photos of her late husband lined the mantel, and a crocheted American flag hung above the fireplace. We sat at her kitchen table, and I laid out the maps and contracts. She didn't say anything for a while, just studied the pages through her reading glasses. Finally, she let out a quiet, "Well, I'll be damned." "So you knew about the original exemptions," I said. "But not this?" She shook her head. "I'd heard whispers. Your grandfather was a proud man, he never flaunted it. But I didn't know it extended to every property beneath the roads. That's monumental." "Karen knows," I said. "That's why she's trying to wipe out anything that might lead back to this." Eleanor nodded. "She wants to erase the past, cover her tracks. If people find out that the HOA's been operating illegally on exempt land, she could face criminal charges," I finished. We stared at each other in silence. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, as if counting down. Finally, Eleanor stood up, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I think it's time we joined forces," she said, sliding it across the table. "These are HOA financial statements. I've been requesting copies every quarter. My Frank taught me how to read them. There's money missing, Eli. Lots of it." I opened the folder and skimmed the top page. Special assessment fees, renovation budgets, contractor payments to companies that didn't exist. Over $300,000 unaccounted for in the last 2 years alone. Eleanor looked me dead in the eye. "She's not just power-hungry," she said. "She's corrupt. And now we've got the proof." I left her house with a folder full of dynamite and a fire in my chest. Karen had no idea what she'd started, and I wasn't about to let her finish it. By the following morning, the story had already started spreading. The bulldozer standoff had been filmed by at least 3 different neighbors, one of whom, I later learned, had uploaded it to Facebook with the caption, "Old Man defends his garden from HOA invasion." It had over 9,000 views by noon. For the first time in 4 years, the quiet tension in Ashridge Village cracked wide open. At the corner coffee shop, people whispered over lattes. At the gas station, someone asked me if it was true that I had out-lawyered the HOA. Even my mailman stopped his truck to give me a thumbs up and say, "About damn time someone stood up TOEM." But not everyone was cheering. That afternoon, I saw Karen's husband, Tom, walking their golden retriever past my property. He didn't wave, didn't look me in the eye, just kept his head down and hurried along. And then there was the envelope, plain white, no return address, slid under my front door while I was in the barn. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Stay out of it. You're poking around where you don't belong." No name, just that typed line, threatening in its simplicity. I smiled when I read it, because it meant one thing. They were scared. At exactly 5:00 p.m., I walked into the Ashridge Community Clubhouse, carrying 2 thick binders, one with land rights and exemptions, and the other with Eleanor's HOA financial reports. I'd asked for time on the HOA's monthly meeting agenda officially. I was there to request a clarification of property jurisdiction. Unofficially, I was about to blow the roof off the place. The room was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls. Neighbors fanned themselves with paper programs. A few people stood in the back. Even Sheriff Martinez had shown up, leaning against the side wall with his arms crossed and a look that said, "I'm not here unless something goes sideways." Karen sat at the front table, flanked by Lance Breyer and 2 other board members. I'd never seen take a breath without her approval. She wore a red blazer and her usual smirk, but I noticed her fingers drumming nervously against her notepad. I cleared my throat and stepped to the mic. "My name is Eli Whitaker," I said. "I live on Willow Lane, and I've been a resident here for 12 years. Some of you know me. Some of you probably think I'm just the cranky guy with the chickens and tomato plants, and that's fine. But what I'm about to share concerns every single one of you." The room quieted. I opened the first binder. My property is one of 5 original homesteads predating the Ashridge Village HOA. The others are owned by neighbors you all know: Eleanor Fielding, Harold Fisher, Susan Winters, and the late John Carter's estate. These properties are exempt from HOA oversight under both county law and state protected historical land deeds. That means the HOA cannot enforce rules, impose fines, or take action against these homeowners. A few murmurs. I raised my voice slightly. "Last week, the HOA attempted to destroy my garden using bulldozers on land I legally own, including the utility easement underneath it. They acted without a court order, without jurisdiction, and in violation of trespassing laws." Someone gasped. I clicked the remote. A projector screen lit up behind me with the scanned image of the 1974 Land Charter Addendum. "Here's the proof. Signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Sheriff Martinez can confirm." Ben gave a single, slow nod. Karen stood up, voice tight. "Mr. Whitaker, this meeting is not the place for personal grievances. If you have issues with board procedure, this isn't about me," I said, cutting her off. "It's about you and what you've done with our community's money." I flipped open the second binder. Over the past 2 years, this HOA has collected over $300,000 in special assessments for projects that were never completed. A pool renovation that never happened. Sidewalk repairs no one's seen. That money didn't vanish into thin air. It went to a company called Shoreline Concepts, LLC. More gasps. The crowd began to murmur louder now. I turned another page. And guess who owns that LLC? According to public business filings, Karen McAllister and Lance Breyer. Karen turned beet red. Lance's eyes darted to the exit. "I've got transaction records, deposit logs, payment histories all matching up with HOA withdrawals. Eleanor Fielding here helped me gather it." Eleanor stood slowly from her seat, in the 3rd row, and raised a hand. "I'm 84 years old," she said, "and I've lived through 4 HOA presidents, but I've never seen one steal from their neighbors." The room erupted, voices overlapping. Angry, confused, some stunned silent. Karen tried to shout over the noise. "This is a setup. He's twisting facts. None of this is admissible. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward now. Karen, I'm going to need you and Mr. Breyer to stay after the meeting. We've got questions. Are you arresting us? Lance snapped. Not yet, the sheriff replied. But I suggest you don't leave town. Karen sat down hard in her chair. Her hands were trembling. I looked around the room, faces I'd known for years, some barely more than polite strangers. But now they were different. Awake, alert, angry. Someone in the back yelled, "Dissolve the board!" Another voice echoed, "Audit everything!" Mr. Jenkins, a retired judge, stood up near the front. I move that we call an emergency vote of no confidence in the current HOA board. Hands flew into the air. Dozens, then more. Eleanor leaned toward me and whispered, "You just lit the match, Eli." I nodded, voice hoarse but steady. "Let's burn it down." The clubhouse was still buzzing. Neighbors huddled in clumps around the folding tables, pointing at copies of the documents I'd printed out and left stacked by the coffee urn. People the first never heard raised their voices, were suddenly shouting things like embezzlement and class action lawsuit. Sheriff Martinez had Karen and Lance seated off to the side, guarded quietly but firmly. The tension in the air was heavy, but there was something else underneath it too, energy. The kind of electricity you feel when a long-buried truth finally sees daylight. I was packing up my folders when Eleanor stepped forward. She walked slowly but deliberately, cane in one hand, a thick manila envelope in the other. "Wait," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a piano string snapping. "Before we end tonight, there's something else I think you all should hear." I paused, watching her make her way to the front. Karen, now visibly shaken, looked up briefly, just enough to roll her eyes, then went back to staring at the floor. Eleanor handed me the envelope. "I was going to give this to you later," she said. "But after that vote, I think everyone deserves to know the whole story." I opened it carefully. Inside were 12 property deeds. Each of them bore the names of longtime residents, people I knew. Harold Fisher, Susan Winters, Derek Walsh, and others. Many were elderly, some widowed, a few living alone. All had one thing in common. "These are exemption deeds," I said, flipping through the stack. "They match mine. Original homesteads." "Karen, did you know these were out there?" Karen didn't respond. "Let me help you," Eleanor said, turning to the room. "A few months ago, I got fined for leaving my Christmas lights up too long. It wasn't the first time. I've paid over $2,000 in penalties over the last 3 years for garden gnomes, for lawn chairs, even for letting my niece park in my driveway overnight." It started to feel personal. A few heads nodded. Mabel, sitting in the front row, whispered something to her neighbor. Others listened, brows furrowed. "So I got curious," Eleanor continued. "I went digging through Frank's old files. My late husband, he was an accountant, had the neatest handwriting you've ever seen, and the most suspicious mind. He kept everything: receipts, meeting notes, copies of letters from the original HOA founders. That's when I found my deed." She pulled a copy from her purse and held it up. "Just like Eli's, dated 1974. With explicit exemption from HOA covenants." Gasps rippled through the room. "That's when I realized," she said, "we weren't alone. So I started knocking on doors." She gestured to the audience. "Harold, Susan, Derek, you all have the same documents, but you didn't know because no one told you. And because someone," she glanced at Karen, "counted on you being too afraid or too tired to ask questions." Harold Fisher stood slowly from his seat near the back. "Karen fined me $500 for my radio antenna. Said it interfered with the neighborhood aesthetic. You telling me that was illegal?" "Yes," I said flatly. "She never had authority over your land." He looked stunned. Susan Winters was next. "They made me take down my bird feeders. Said it attracted rodents. My late husband built those with our grandson." Eleanor placed a hand on Susan's shoulder. "You never should have been made to remove them." All around us, heads were nodding. And then came the real gut punch delivered by Eleanor, like she'd been rehearsing it in her mind for months. "There's more," she said. "I found evidence that Karen and Lance planned to target the original exempt properties. They'd marked us people living alone, mostly elderly, as weak spots. Easy to pressure, easy to fine, and eventually easy to push out." She pulled another document from her bag and handed it to Sheriff Martinez. He read it. Then again. "It's a purchase agreement," he said slowly, "for 5 properties, including yours, Eleanor, signed by a shell company called WLC Holdings." "WLC," I echoed. "Whitmore Lance Consulting." Eleanor nodded grimly. "They plan to force us out," she said. "Buy our homes cheap under threat of liens or endless fines, then flip them for profit. We weren't just a nuisance, we were an investment opportunity." The room erupted. Outrage, disbelief, fury. Karen stood now, her hands clenched into fists. "You people don't understand how hard it is to run a community. I did what I had to do to keep property values up, to maintain standards. By lying to us?" someone shouted. "By stealing from us?" another added. "By harassing widows?" Eleanor's voice rang out, stronger than ever. Karen turned toward her, something sharp and ugly in her eyes. "You're nothing but a bitter old woman clinging to a shack and a flag your husband left behind. You think these people care about you now? Just wait." But the room was already lost to her. People were standing, raising voices, not in chaos, but in unity. Someone started chanting, "New board! New board!" until others joined in. The sound echoed off the walls like a drumbeat. I looked at Karen and saw it, not just fear but isolation. The power she held for years had evaporated in a matter of minutes. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward. "Karen Whitmore, Lance Breyer, you're being placed under investigation for fraud, misuse of community funds, and attempted unlawful seizure of property. Until further notice, you are removed from all HOA activities." "You can't do this," Karen shrieked. "My husband plays golf with Judge Reagan. I don't care if he plays poker with the governor," Sheriff said. "You broke the law. Now you're going to answer for it." As the sheriff escorted them from the clubhouse, the room erupted not in panic, but in applause. And in the middle of it all, Eleanor reached out and took my hand. "You didn't just save your garden," she whispered. "You reminded this town who it belongs to." I didn't reply right away. I looked around at my neighbors, people hugging, talking, making plans, sharing stories they'd been afraid to voice for years. We weren't just reclaiming our rights. We were rebuilding a community together. The next morning, the clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and vindication. Karen and Lance were gone, escorted out the night before with nothing but their briefcases and their reputations in ruins. But for me and Eleanor, the real work was just beginning. We met in my kitchen, both of us still in our pajamas, surrounded by mountains of paper. Eleanor sipped peppermint tea, while I pored over spreadsheets and scanned receipts into my laptop. "We're looking for a pattern," I muttered. "But all I see is a tornado of nonsense." "That's by design," Eleanor said calmly. "The first rule of cooking the books is to make the soup too thick to stir." I chuckled, but there was a tight knot in my chest. This wasn't just about catching Karen red-handed anymore. It was about how far down the rot went and whether we could shine a light on all of it before someone tried to bury it again. Eleanor pulled a paper from her folder and slid it across the table. "Here," she said. This was the first one that caught my eye. "Look at the amount." It was an invoice for $47,000 paid to a company called Shoreline Asset Solutions, allegedly for landscape renovations and drainage improvements to the community park. Problem was, the park hadn't changed in 3 years. Not a single new plant, not a single square foot of drainage redone. "That's bold," I muttered. "It gets bolder," Eleanor said. She opened another folder labeled WCE Holdings, LLC. Every contractor listed in the last 2 years ties back to one of 3 shell companies. And guess who the registered agents are? I didn't even have to guess. Karen and Lance. Bingo. We spent the rest of the day cross-referencing invoices, payments, and county permit filings. The deeper we dug, the more brazen the theft became. One payment of $62,500 for community pool restoration, the pool hadn't been touched. Another for tree removal services, but the trees in question still lined the walking path like nothing had happened. I rubbed my eyes, staring at the computer screen. This is embezzlement, plain and simple. It's also fraud, wire misuse, and possibly tax evasion, Eleanor added cheerfully. You seem very calm about this. She smiled into her teacup. Frank was an accountant for 42 years. He always said, if you want to find the devil, just follow the decimals. By late afternoon, we had a spreadsheet outlining over $318,000 in questionable transactions. But it was what we found next that made the air go cold. A series of internal HOA memos buried deep in a folder Eleanor had requested under the Freedom of Information Act detailed a proposed enforcement expansion plan. It targeted 5 properties that had been fined repeatedly over the last year, all of them owned by elderly residents. All of them exempt properties. And next to each name, typed neatly in a column, was a projected acquisition cost. They weren't just harassing people. They were pricing us out. Eleanor stared at the list, her hand trembling slightly as she traced the names with her finger. They were going to take our homes, she whispered. One by one. They still might, I said grimly. Not Karen and Lance. Maybe, but anyone they worked with. Anyone waiting in the wings. I stood up and grabbed my coat. We need to go public. Eleanor blinked. With what? With all of it, I said. The documents, the accounts, the shell companies, the acquisition plan, everything. If we don't do it now, someone will try to spin this. Make us look like the troublemakers. She nodded. Then we'd better move fast. Within 2 hours, we had a press packet assembled scanned documents, a bullet point summary of findings, and a link to a cloud folder with every file. I sent it to Channel 6 News, the Ashridge Gazette, and a handful of watchdog bloggers Eleanor followed on her ancient desktop computer. And just for good measure, I printed 20 physical copies and stuck them in manila envelopes. Hand-delivered them to every house on Willow Lane. The next morning, it exploded. Channel 6 aired a segment titled, Corruption in Ashridge, HOA Funds Missing, Seniors Targeted. They showed Eleanor's bird feeder, my tomato garden, and even footage from the bulldozer standoff. By noon, we had reporters parked outside our homes. By 2:00 p.m., the county comptroller announced a formal audit of the Ashridge Village HOA. And by dinner, I got a call from State Attorney Mallory Hartwell herself. Mr. Whitaker, she said, her voice clipped but respectful. We've reviewed the documents you submitted. I've assigned 2 investigators to the case. Do not destroy or alter anything. I wouldn't dream of it, I said. You'll find everything's been backed up 3 times. She chuckled faintly. Good. You've done half our job already. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the oaks, Eleanor came over carrying a pie. You've earned this, she said. Apple? Of course. We sat in silence for a while, sharing dessert like old friends. The kind who've seen war together, even if theirs was fought with paperwork and pressure rather than rifles. Do you think it's over? She asked finally. I shook my head. I think it's just beginning. I was up late that night, trying to ignore the flood of emails pouring in from reporters, lawyers, and residents from other towns. Apparently, our HOA war had struck a nerve. People were sharing their own stories, photos of fines for wind chimes, letters threatening foreclosure over driveway cracks, tales of harassment that spanned decades. It should have made me feel good. Instead, it made me feel something else, exposed. At around 2:45 a.m., I got the first text. You should have stayed quiet, Eli. No number, just those 6 words. Then, 15 minutes later, my security app buzzed. The motion-activated cameras around my property had picked up movement. I tapped the screen and froze. There they were, 2 figures, dressed in black. One tall, the other stockier. Even in the low-light footage, I recognized them. Karen and Lance. My stomach dropped. I watched, helpless, as they moved through the yard like they owned it. Lance carried a shovel. Karen, a flashlight. They made no effort to hide what they were doing. They stomped through my garden beds, yanked out tomato plants by the roots, and threw them across the lawn. At one point, Karen looked straight into the camera, smiled coldly, and made a slicing motion across her neck. The feed cut out. I called the sheriff immediately. "Don't move," he said. "We'll be there in 10 minutes." He wasn't wrong. Within 9 minutes, 2 cruisers pulled up, lights flashing. I met them on the porch, still barefoot, my heart hammering. They swept the yard, took statements, reviewed the footage. But by the time they arrived, Karen and Lance were gone. Sheriff Martinez was furious. "We already have them under investigation," he said, shaking his head. "Now they're escalating. Trespassing, vandalism, and with that gesture on camera, possibly a threat." "They're not thinking straight anymore," I said. "They're desperate. You realize this makes you a target," he added quietly. "I already was," I replied. "Now it's just obvious." The next morning, I barely had time to grab coffee before reporters were on my lawn. "Is it true the HOA president vandalized your property? Are you pressing charges? Do you feel safe?" I answered the questions calmly, sticking to facts. I showed them the footage. I gave them Eleanor's binder. And when they asked if I had a message for Karen and Lance, I said, "This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. If they'd rather tear up a garden than face justice, that says more about them than me." By noon, Channel 6 aired the story. By 2 o'clock, I had 20 neighbors in my front yard, holding shovels and carrying plants. "We're with you," said Miss S. Jenkins, who I barely knew before last week. "Karen fined me $500 for my bird feeder. I've been waiting for a reason to plant something real." I couldn't speak. I just nodded and stepped aside. Together, we rebuilt the garden. By dinner time, it looked better than ever. Bright rows of basil, rosemary, cherry tomatoes, even a few raspberry bushes someone brought from their own yard. But it wasn't the plants that mattered. It was the people. We weren't afraid anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Sheriff Martinez returned with an update. "We've arrested them," he said simply. My jaw dropped. "Already?" He nodded. "They weren't exactly hiding. We found them trying to access the HOA storage unit. Caught them with documents, hard drives, even a checkbook with forged board signatures." He handed me a printed list. "We're still going through the evidence, but the county's preliminary audit shows over $330 in HOA funds unaccounted for." I whistled. "That's grand larceny." "And more," he added. "Wire fraud, racketeering, possibly conspiracy. The DA's office is taking this seriously." I glanced over at my garden, at the neighbors still chatting in small groups, hands in dirt, smiles on their faces. For the first time in weeks, I let myself relax. Maybe, just maybe, this was finally the turning point. Then my phone buzzed again. Blocked number. This time, it wasn't a text, it was a photo. I tapped it open and froze. It was a picture of my property deed, the original 1831 charter. Across it, written in red Sharpie, were the words, "Originals burn so easily." My blood turned cold. I bolted inside and raced to the old safe where I kept the physical documents. The metal was still cool to the touch. I opened it, everything was still there, intact, untouched. But I knew what the message meant. They weren't finished. I called Eleanor. "They're still coming after us," I said, "even after the arrests." There was a long pause. Then her voice, calm but firm. "We have to take this public. Not just local news, bigger, statewide, national, if we can. They tried to silence us. Now we make sure everyone hears us. Even if it puts targets on our backs." She didn't hesitate, especially then. That night, we emailed every major news outlet from Boston to DC. We compiled a full timeline, attached every scanned document, and included the threats. By midnight, the Boston Herald had replied, They wanted an interview. I stared at the screen, barely able to believe it. This wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. This was a movement. 3 days after Karen and Lance were arrested, we packed the Ashridge High School gymnasium with more people than I'd seen in one place since the county fair. Cars lined the streets. News vans from Portland and Boston clogged the parking lot. Inside, the bleachers were filled to capacity. Young families, retirees, local business owners, even teenagers, holding handmade signs like "Let us garden in peace" and "No more HOA tyranny." I stood near the front with Eleanor, my binder under one arm and a stack of printed resolutions in the other. I'd worn my best flannel shirt clean, tucked in, the kind my wife always said made me look respectably rebellious. Sheriff Martinez was off to the side, chatting with the DA's lead investigator. Members of the press milled near the entrance. There was a quiet tension in the room, like everyone was waiting for permission to exhale. I stepped to the microphone. "My name is Eli Whitaker," I began. "Some of you know me. Some of you have only seen my face on the news these past few weeks. But tonight isn't about me. It's about us, what we've been through, what we've learned, and what we do next." A few nods. Silence. Listening. 2 weeks ago, I continued, I just wanted to grow tomatoes. And now, here we are exposing corruption, fighting intimidation, and rediscovering the kind of community spirit we all thought we'd lost. I paused. Let me be clear. This isn't a rebellion against structure. We all want clean streets, safe neighborhoods, and mutual respect. But what we don't want is unchecked power. We don't want board members acting like monarchs. We don't want threats, lies, or backdoor deals. A smattering of applause, then more. We've seen what happens when a system designed to protect becomes a tool for control. And we've seen how easy it is to stay silent when someone else is the target until we become the target ourselves. I held up a copy of the resolution. That ends tonight. The resolution was simple. Dissolve the existing HOA charter, nullify all fines issued under Karen's illegal oversight, and appoint a temporary community council until a fair election could be held. No more secret meetings. No more power grabs. Just neighbors looking out for each other. "I motion we vote now," said Judge Jenkins from the front row. "Right here, right now." The room murmured in agreement. We passed out ballots, pre-printed yes or no slips. They were collected in 5 plastic bins by volunteers, tallied by 3 independent community members, and verified by the DA's office observers. The final count? 312 yes, 11 no. The room erupted. Some people stood and clapped. Others cried. I saw Harold Fisher embrace his daughter. Susan Winters leaned into her cane and whispered a prayer. And right beside me, Eleanor grinned wide and said, "Frank would have loved this, but we weren't done yet." Once the cheering settled, I called for nominations to the interim council. Hands shot up. People who'd once been passive now leaned forward, engaged and eager. A retired teacher, a local shop owner, a veteran with a calm voice and a steady hand. Eleanor, of course, nominated unanimously. Me too, though I hesitated at first. "You've earned the right," Eleanor whispered. "Now use it." So I accepted. The council was sworn in with a simple oath to serve with transparency, humility, and respect. Nothing fancy, no fanfare, just words that meant something. Our first act? We abolished the special assessments Karen had imposed, refunded as much as possible, and froze all HOA activity pending investigation. Our second act? We created something new, the Ashridge Neighborhood Cooperative. No dues, no fines, no enforcement squads, just an open forum where residents could volunteer, organize, and contribute ideas to make the town better by choice, not by coercion. A woman named Lena stood and offered to start a gardening club. Someone else suggested a community tool shed. A teenager offered to repaint the old park benches for his Eagle Scout project. The ideas flowed like water from a long clogged pipe. And just like that, The town began to heal. Over the next week, the changes were visible. People were outside again, not out of fear, but to wave at each other, help rake leaves, or talk about compost. Someone donated paint to fix up the playground. A group of neighbors rebuilt the park gazebo. The pool left untouched by the supposed renovations was cleaned, repaired, and reopened with volunteer labor and donated materials. No fines, no threats, no bureaucracy, just pride. One evening, I walked through the neighborhood with a cup of coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other. We were taking suggestions for future improvements, bike racks, a bulletin board, maybe even a monthly town potluck. As I passed Eleanor's house, she waved me in. "Got something for you," she said. It was an old photo, black and white, slightly faded, of my grandfather standing beside hers, shoulder to shoulder, in front of the same high school gym where we'd just held the vote. "Found this in a drawer," she said softly. "Thought you should have it." I stared at it for a long time. "They built this place from nothing," I said. "And we almost let it slip away," she added. "But now we're getting it back." We sat together for a while, no words needed. Outside, the porch light flickered on. Children's laughter echoed in the distance. The smell of barbecue drifted from someone's yard. And for the first time in a long time, Ashridge didn't feel like a place I was defending. It felt like home. 2 months later, on a crisp Saturday morning in late October, I walked out to my front porch with a mug of black coffee, still piping hot, and looked out over the land that had caused so much trouble and so much change. The sun was just rising above the trees, casting long golden shadows across the freshly tilled rows of my garden. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, even a patch of pumpkins we'd planted in late August for the kids to pick. The raspberry bushes were taller than I'd expected, tangled but thriving. And surrounding it all were pieces of this community, literal pieces. A wooden bench someone had donated from their porch, a sign that read, "The People's Garden," hand-painted by local teens, and a little stone path. Eleanor laid herself with help from 2 neighbor boys, who used to get fined for riding their scooters on the sidewalk. It was no longer just my garden. It belonged to everyone now. I sat down on the porch swing and took a sip of coffee. Quiet. For the first time in years, there was no tension buzzing beneath the surface. No letters taped to my door. No HOA threats hanging over my head like a thundercloud. Just fall air and birdsong. A few minutes later, Eleanor appeared with a basket full of muffins and a box of papers tucked under her arm. She moved slower these days, but her steps had purpose, like someone who finally knew she had ground to stand on. "You look too relaxed," she said, handing me a muffin. "Not a single bulldozer in sight," I replied. "It's suspicious." She laughed and sat beside me. "Got a letter from the DA this morning." My eyebrow arched. "Good news or bad?" She opened the box. Inside were legal filings, dozens of them. "Karen and Lance took a plea deal," she said. 2 years probation, full restitution, and barred from participating in any community governance for life. I let out a slow breath. "That's a start. They'll pay every penny," Eleanor said. And the new council voted to donate the recovered funds toward rebuilding the pool, repairing the park, and establishing a legal aid fund for residents in case something like this ever happens again. I nodded, trying not to let the emotions sneak up on me. "They tried to erase us," I said quietly. "Erase our rights, our voices, our history. They failed," she replied. "Because you didn't give up." I shook my head. "I didn't win this alone. I just happened to be the guy with a stubborn streak and a really old deed." She smiled and pulled something else from the box. It was a plaque, hand-carved, simple. "Ashridge Community Garden, in honor of Eli Whitaker," and the originals "I didn't speak, couldn't." Eleanor placed it in my lap and gave my hand a squeeze. "We're going to hang it by the gate, right next to the one for Frank." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Later that afternoon, we held our first official block party as the Ashridge Neighborhood Cooperative. No agenda, no speeches, just food, music, and people who were finally getting to know each other again. The smell of barbecue filled the air. Kids ran through leaf piles. Someone set up a table for pumpkin painting. I saw Mabel dancing with Harold, both grinning like teenagers. Susan Winters brought her bird feeders back out, painted them bright blue, and hung them high with pride. Even the mayor stopped by. He gave me a firm handshake and said, "You reminded us what local power really means." I didn't need to say much back. I just pointed to the crowd. That night, long after the sun went down and most folks had headed home, I stood at the edge of the garden, looking at what we'd built, what we'd saved. It wasn't just about tomatoes. It never had been. It was about standing firm when others try to move you, about holding on to truth, even when it's buried under decades of paperwork and intimidation, about neighbors choosing each other, time and again, over fear and silence. As I walked back to the porch, I noticed something tucked inside my mailbox. No envelope, just a folded sheet of paper. I unfolded it. "You did good," I smiled. Frank Fielding had passed years ago, but somehow, I knew Eleanor had saved that note for just the right moment. Or maybe she hadn't written it at all. Maybe Frank was still watching. As I sat back in my old wooden chair, I thought about all the times I'd nearly walked away, all the nights I'd stared at legal codes, wondering if I was crazy, all the quiet anger I'd swallowed just to keep peace. And now I had peace, real peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of something better. A community rebuilt not through control, but through choice. I didn't want to own the county, never did. I just wanted to grow my vegetables. And in doing that, I helped grow something much bigger, something worth protecting, something worth planting again. In the end, this story wasn't about gardens, deeds, or even bulldozers. It was about dignity, about how easy it is, especially as we get older, for people to overlook us, to silence us, or to assume we're too tired to stand up for what's right. But I've learned that age isn't a weakness, it's our strength. It gives us roots, and when your roots run deep, storms can't shake you. What happened in Ashridge reminded me that no matter how small our battles may seem, whether it's a flower bed, a front porch, or a voice that's gone unheard for too long, they matter. Because when we stand up, others find the courage to do the same. And when we stand together, we don't just protect what we love, we rebuild what we've lost. If you've ever been bullied by those in power, silenced by a system, or told you don't belong in your own neighborhood anymore, this story is for you. So if this touched your heart, or reminded you of your own fight, I hope you'll do 3 small things that can make a big difference. Like this video, so more people see it. Share it with a friend or neighbor who might need a little strength today. And subscribe to this channel for more stories that prove it's never too late to take a stand and never too late to grow something beautiful. Because we're not just planting gardens, we're planting hope. One seed, one truth, one neighbor at a time.